castles evolved, or from wooden forts to stone giants, or 1,500 years of evolution. Imagine you are standing on a hill in the dead of winter. The year is 900 AD. Below you, a village burns. You can hear the screaming. You have no army. You have no walls. You have nothing but the clothes on your back and the hill beneath your feet. What do you build? That question, desperate, urgent, born from survival, is where this story begins. Castles were not built because kings wanted monuments to their power. They were built because warfare demanded them. Every tower, every wall, every iron gate and hidden murder hole was the answer to a specific military problem. And as soon as builders found an answer, attackers found a new question. For 15 centuries, this arms race never stopped. The castle didn't arrive fully formed. It didn't spring from the mind of a brilliant architect sketching blueprints by candlelight. It was dragged into existence by chaos, forged siege by siege, raid by raid, catastrophe by catastrophe, until the medieval world had produced some of the most sophisticated defensive structures in human history. And then a cannonball ended it all. This is the story of how castles evolved. Not because builders wanted grander buildings, but because survival left them no other choice. To understand why castles were necessary, you have to understand what happened when Rome collapsed. For 4 centuries, Roman legions had held the Western world together. Roads, garrisons, watchtowers, standing armies, Rome had created a continent-wide security network. When that network fell apart in the 5th century, it didn't happen cleanly. It unraveled. Slowly, then catastrophically. Without Roman authority, Western Europe fractured into a patchwork of territories ruled by local warlords, petty kings, and anyone strong enough to hold land by force. There were no national armies, no organized border defenses, just scattered communities with no protection beyond what they could build themselves. And then the Vikings arrived. From the late 8th century onward, Norse raiders struck with terrifying speed, sailing up rivers that had no business being navigated, attacking monasteries, villages, and trading settlements before any local force could respond. The Magyars raided from the east, the Saracens pressed from the south. Europe was being hit from every direction by enemies who moved faster than any organized defense could handle. Out of this chaos came feudalism, a system built not around ideology but around fear. Lords offered land and protection to those who swore loyalty and military service. Those lords in turn swore allegiance to greater lords above them. At the center of every feudal arrangement was one assumption: the lord could actually defend his people. To do that, he needed a stronghold. The first castles were not stone. They were dirt and timber, thrown up in days by men who didn't have the luxury of time. The motte-and-bailey design was breathtakingly simple. A lord's men would pile earth into a steep artificial mound, the motte, sometimes 15 to 30 feet high. On top sat a wooden tower, the lord's last refuge. Below it spread the bailey, an enclosed courtyard of workshops, stables and housing, ringed by a wooden palisade fence and often surrounded by a ditch. The Normans, who spread this design across England, France and southern Italy in the 11th century, could erect one of these fortifications in a matter of weeks. That speed was the entire point. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, he didn't just win at Hastings. He spent the following years planting motte-and-bailey castles across the country like a military grid, physically locking down conquered territory before resistance could organize. The psychological effect was enormous. Peasants who had never seen a fortified tower rising over their valley suddenly had a visible symbol of authority planted in their landscape. Power made physical. But wood had a fatal weakness, and every attacker in Europe knew it: fire. A single torch held to a wooden palisade could unravel months of construction. Axes could breach a wooden gate faster than swords could defend it. And even without enemy action, timber rotted, warped, and collapsed under its own weight. Wood had solved the problem of speed. It had created the problem of permanence. Stone would fix that. The shift from timber to stone was not instant. It was expensive, slow, and required skilled labor that most lords struggled to afford. But the lords who could afford it discovered something remarkable. A stone tower didn't just resist fire. It changed the entire nature of siege warfare. The great square stone keeps that began rising across Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries were statements of military philosophy. Conisburg in England, the Tower of London, the White Tower, begun by William the Conqueror himself. These structures weren't simply shelters, they were self-contained fortresses. Walls 12 feet thick at their base. Floors stacked with food storage, cisterns to collect rainwater, great halls where garrisons could shelter for months. A well-stocked stone keep could simply refuse to fall. Attackers began to learn a brutal lesson. You cannot burn stone, you cannot rot it. You cannot chop through 12 feet of limestone with an axe. So they tried something else. They tried to starve it out. And this revealed the square keep's fatal flaw. The the corners. 4 sharp right angles where stone walls met at 90 degrees created blind spots. Defenders standing on the wall could see almost everything, but not directly below the corner itself. Attackers learned to crowd into that corner, pressing against the base, and do something even more dangerous than battering rams or fire. They started digging. Medieval miners, sappers, would tunnel beneath a corner tower, pack the void with timber, and set it alight. When the timber burned away, the ground collapsed, and so did the corner. A technique exactly as devastating as it sounds. Square corners were becoming a liability. Someone would need to rethink the shape of the tower itself. By the 12th and 13th centuries, military architects were no longer just building walls. They were engineering killing systems. The round tower was the solution to the sapper's tunnel. A curved base deflected the collapse of undermined ground far better than a right angle. More importantly, a round tower gave defenders something priceless: flanking fire. From the curved face of a round tower, archers could shoot along the length of the wall, raking attackers who pressed against it with arrows from a completely unexpected angle. The blind spot was gone. But one wall was no longer considered enough. Concentric castle design, pioneered and perfected in the Crusader states and brought back to Europe through 2 centuries of hard military experience, stacked defensive ring inside defensive ring. If attackers breached the outer wall, they didn't reach the keep. They entered a narrow killing ground between 2 walls, sealed in on both sides by defenders above them. Archers on the inner wall could shoot over the heads of defenders on the outer wall. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to regroup, and no way forward that wasn't covered by a field of fire from multiple directions. Into this architecture went every refinement military minds had devised. Moats, wide water barriers that made mining nearly impossible, and ladders nearly useless. Drawbridges that retracted to become walls. Portcullises, iron grills that could drop instantly, trapping attackers in the gateway passage. Barbicans, extended outer gatehouses that forced attackers to fight through a fortified corridor before they ever reached the main gate. And above the gates, builders added murder holes. Stone passages over the entrance tunnel, with openings in the ceiling through which defenders could drop rocks, pour boiling water, or rain arrows onto anyone who broke through the outer gate and thought they were safe. The name isn't poetry, it's a description. These castles, carefully in Wales, Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, Beaumaris on Anglesey, represented something extraordinary, a military mind made into stone. Every element solved a specific problem. Every wall angle, every tower position, every slit and opening was calculated. But attackers, as always, were thinking too. The great siege engines of the medieval world were marvels of engineering in their own right, and they forced every defensive calculation to be rethought. The mangonel hurled stones in a curved arc, effective against wooden structures and lighter fortifications. The trebuchet was something else entirely. A counterweight trebuchet, at full scale, could launch projectiles weighing 300 pounds with remarkable consistency, striking the same point in a wall again and again until the masonry cracked and buckled. Defenders who had built to resist battering rams suddenly found their wall ished from 100 meters away. Siege towers, massive rolling wooden structures pushed toward walls, attempted to negate the height advantage defenders depended on, delivering soldiers directly onto the battlements. Fire attacks tried to force gates. Mining tried to collapse walls. Battering rams tried to shatter them. Every technique targeted a different weakness, and every weakness, if exposed often enough, produced a new defensive answer: thicker walls. Deeper moats to stop siege towers rolling forward. Sloped stone bases around towers, called taluses, that deflected falling debris outward and made mining approaches harder. Overlapping fields of fire that meant no part of a wall could be approached without drawing arrows from 2 directions simultaneously. The arms race accelerated. Every innovation on one side forced an innovation on the other. And then, in the 14th century, something arrived on the battlefield that no stone wall, however thick, however high, however ingeniously designed, could answer. The first gunpowder weapons were crude. Early bombards, squat, ugly iron tubes, were expensive, unreliable, and as likely to kill their operators as their targets. Medieval commanders watched them with curiosity rather than fear. A trebuchet could still outperform them. Stone walls still stood. Then the technology improved. By the mid-15th century, cannon had become mobile, powerful, and capable of something no previous siege weapon had achieved at scale, sustained devastating impact against the foundations of stone walls. Not just chipping at the surface, destroying the structural base. On the 29th of May, 1453, the walls of Constantinople, walls that had held for over 1,000 years, walls that had repelled Arab armies, Bulgarian forces, and Crusader sieges alike, fell to the cannon of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. His master gunner, or ban, had cast weapons of unprecedented size specifically for this siege. The great Theodosian walls, which had been the most impressive defensive fortification in the medieval world, crumbled under bombardment that lasted weeks. The message reached every military mind in Europe within a generation. High medieval walls were now obsolete. The response came not in towers and keeps, but in a completely different geometric language. Engineers lowered walls and thickened them dramatically, wide enough to absorb cannon impact without shattering. They added angled earthen banks to deflect cannon balls rather than absorb them directly. They designed protruding angular bastions, star-shaped extensions that allowed flanking fire across every approach, eliminating dead ground that cannon crews could exploit. The Star Fort replaced the medieval castle, and the age that had produced Carnarvon and crack des Chevaliers was over. Stand back now and look at 15 centuries of human ingenuity. Every wooden palisade that burned down taught someone where to find stone. Every square corner that collapsed under a sapper's tunnel gave birth to the round tower. Every blind spot in a wall produced a new flanking position. Every battering ram inspired a deeper gatehouse. Every trebuchet produced a thicker curtain wall. Every tunnel produced a moat. Every weakness, when it killed enough people, became a problem that the next generation of builders swore to solve. Castles were not architecture. They were arguments made in stone, mortar, iron, and timber, against the most persuasive argument of the medieval world, violence. And they worked. For centuries they worked. They held civilizations together through the collapse of empires, through Viking winters and Crusader summers, through plague and famine and civil war. They gave the medieval world something it desperately needed, a place where the walls were stronger than the weapons aimed at them. Until one gunner cast a barrel wide enough and long enough and filled it with enough powder and aimed it at walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Every stone castle you will ever see, every crumbling tower on a hilltop, every ivy-draped ruin beside a river, is the answer to a question that warfare once asked. The question changed. The answer had to change with it. That is why they built. That is why they kept building. And that is why, when they finally stopped, the world that replaced them was already something altogether different.